Some countries have already pulled out: Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, because they can't afford the participation fees, which will inevitably go up because they no longer have the income from Russia. But in this case, I think, money doesn't matter so much. It's about standing up for your values, and sometimes there is a right and a wrong. And I think it's to Eurovision's credit they're realizing that. But where do we draw the line? There's a lot of countries in Eurovision: Israel, Azerbaijan, Serbia. They have sometimes tricky situations politically. How does that get navigated? And where do you draw the line when it comes to Eurovision and who's welcome and who's not? Hi there, my name's Dr. Paul Jordan, and I'm an expert on the Eurovision Song Contest. And I wrote my PhD looking at Eurovision in Estonia and Ukraine.
Let's go back to when the Soviet Union was first formed, because Soviet Union wasn't allowed to take part in Eurovision, and then they created their own version of Eurovision. What was it? Intervision, I think that's what it was. Could you talk to me about that period of time and the significance of that?
Yeah, so the Soviet Union never entered Eurovision, although there was certainly some countries that did, that were communist. So Yugoslavia used to enter, and that was really an example of them being kind of, I guess, expressing their cultural autonomy from the other communist countries. Estonia did follow Eurovision, though, in the 70s and 80s because they watched it on Finnish television. But the Soviets tried to set up a rival version called Intervision, which wasn't particularly popular and didn't really last very long. But it was an opportunity to really try and compete with the West, if you like, because they weren't joining Eurovision itself. It was seen as decadent, and it was seen as too Western European. And it's interesting that as soon as a lot of the countries became independent, they entered Eurovision for the first time. There was like a big influx of countries in 1993 and 1994. Bosnia-Herzegovina took part in 1993 when they were actually at war, and the team actually escaped gunfire from Sarajevo airport to take part. So that shows you the significance of the event for giving Bosnia-Herzegovina a platform. They were there on the world stage despite everything which was happening back home, which is why also when Ukraine entered last year, it was hugely important for them that they were there, and it was business as usual because they did not want to be seen as kind of being defeated, and certainly didn't want to be seen as not being there at something that they're so good at.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, how did post-Soviet states did post-Soviet states, did they struggle with their new sort of national identity? And if so, how was that reflected within Eurovision and their representation at Eurovision?
When countries became independent, they entered Eurovision for the first time, and that was really in the very early days of independence. And you might think that's maybe not necessarily their priority, but in those days, the priority was visibility and recognition. And so things like Eurovision, the Olympic Games, the World Cup are all opportunities to stand there, have your flag on screen, and become known on that world stage, and to be part of a wider community. So we shouldn't underplay the value that Eurovision has. In terms of how countries represented themselves, they all had to enter in those days singing songs in their own language. So there's an opportunity to showcase their languages, but it also was a time when there were internal debates around, immigration and around citizenship. So for a lot of the former Soviet countries that had large Russian-speaking populations that had moved there during the Soviet Union, that was a big dilemma for them. And certainly when Estonia hosted the Eurovision in 2002, they had a theme called Fairy Tale, and it was all around different fairy tales between the songs, and that was the postcards, if you like, between the entries that year. And the one for Estonia was themed around Sleeping Beauty, and it was basically Estonia saying that they've awoken from the slumbers of Soviet rule, eager to take their place in the world. And the one for the Russian entry they put was a story from Pushkin about a goldfish, and it was around, the theme was freedom, and so that was a deliberate thing, and it was kind of jokey and it was fine, but it was a deliberate political tactic. But within Estonia itself, they were facing scrutiny as they were trying to join the EU. They were having EU accession talks at the time that they hosted, and Eurovision really became involved in that in terms of promoting the international image of Estonia as a Nordic country. By saying what you are, you're also saying what you're not. And in that case, Estonians were saying, we're not Russian. But you've got a third of the country that really identified as Russian. And that was tricky to navigate. And certainly that's where Estonia's winner, Dave Benton from 2001, he was a kind of useful figure, if you like, for the political elite, because he was a man who moved from Aruba. He was the first and to date only black singer to win Eurovision. And they were able to say, actually, Estonia is multicultural at a time when they were facing scrutiny for their policies towards the Russian speaking minority. So certainly Eurovision became useful for politicians in a lot of newly independent countries. And you've seen the same again in Azerbaijan when they hosted it in 2012. It showcased Azerbaijan as they wanted to be seen. But Azerbaijan has a really tricky political situation. It's a dictatorship. There is no freedom of the press. And Eurovision shone a spotlight on that. So by wanting to be seen on that world stage, you also open yourself up to scrutiny. It gets a dialogue going, though. And if it hadn't have been for Eurovision, we wouldn't have been talking about it. Georgia entered a song called We Don't Want to Putin, and it came the year after the war with Russia. But Eurovision was taking place in Moscow that year, and the Russians complained. They said it was just a play on words, but they refused to change the lyrics and then therefore had to leave the competition. But certainly these things spill over into Eurovision. In 2007, Ukraine entered a drag queen called Verka Serduchka, who's gone on to become a bit of an icon. But the song Dancing Lasha Tumbai came second, but the chorus sounds very suspiciously like Russia Goodbye. And in fact, since the war, Verka has been doing concerts singing Russia Goodbye. So you could argue that that is an example of the kind of nationalist politics which has crept into Eurovision from time to time.
And there's also like a lot of contention within Ukraine about some of the Ukrainian representatives.
So I think Ukraine's Eurovision history is a really interesting one. They won in their second year, and they won with a song called Wild Dances by Ruslana. Now, Ruslana was chosen by the PR company who first tried to enter Eurovision with Ukraine. It wasn't the public vote. And Ruslana is from the west of the country. Now, the western Ukraine tends to be more Ukrainian speaking. It tends to be a little bit more nationalistic. And certainly Ruslana's entry, sung part English, part Ukrainian, had certain elements of national culture, if you like. There's certain traditional instruments, and it was a good song. But it was, interestingly, it raised questions around who decides what is Ukrainian and what represents Ukraine. And in this case, it seemed to be a small elite group. And the same thing happened in 2005. Ukraine were hosting it. They had a national selection that year, and there was the revolution which took place in the meantime. So there was a lot of kind of political tensions. There was one singer, a very famous singer called Annie Lorak. She had, during the revolution, supported the pro-Russian candidate, Yanukovych. And then on the other hand, you had Green Jolly, who eventually went on to represent Ukraine. They were inserted at the request of a culture minister at last minute as a wild card. And, it's no surprise that they were the government's favourite, if you like. They had supported the then candidate who was pro-Western, pro-European, Viktor Yushchenko, and he went on to become the president. Now, that was largely seen as a political decision to insert them at the last minute. And again, it raises that question of what is Ukraine and how representative are these entries of wider Ukraine, and who is deciding what is Ukrainian and what is Ukrainianness. And certainly Gaetana in 2012, she had a song called Be My Guest. It was the anthem when they were hosting Euro 2012 of Poland. And again, it raised questions around immigration, around what's happening in Ukraine, because a politician had tried to get her disqualified. In his words, she was not a representative of organic Ukraine. And so basically, it was a racist slur, and he tried to get her disqualified. Gaetana was incredibly upset by that, but certainly when it came to Eurovision, she was speaking about her love for Ukraine. But it's interesting that she also wore the Ukrainian headdress as well during her performance. So she was really showing that she was part of modern multicultural Ukraine. But how that is received within the country, both within the political elite and the wider public, that remains a little bit more contentious. But certainly Ukraine's positioning on how it positions itself on that Eurovision stage is sometimes at odds with how the people feel back home.
It's like a natural rule within Eurovision that the song lyrics aren't supposed to be political, right? After the Russian invasion in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, Ukraine won Eurovision, didn't they? But their song was also, they had connotations that were that could be interpreted as being political as well, weren't they?
Well, I think certainly the tensions with Russia come out quite clearly in Eurovision. In 2014, Russia had two twins. They were singing their song. It was called Shine, but there was a few lines in that I think were a little bit sinister. It was step by step closer to the line, one day you'll be mine. This is at the same time that Crimea had been annexed. So you could argue there's real kind of parallels in terms of what was happening there. Ukraine had a song called TikTok that year, and it was meant to be a love song, but it also could be interpreted in different ways as well. Certainly, there were a lot of tensions between the delegations that year. Interestingly, though, the Russians did not give interviews, whereas the Ukrainian singer, who spoke very good English, was very, very happy to talk about the situation in Crimea. So it's interesting that they were already fighting this kind of battle in terms of popular culture. But when Ukraine won in 2016, they won with a song called 1944, which was about Crimean Tatars and deportations during World War II. Now, you could argue that that's technically not political because it doesn't actually reference anyone, any specific countries. It's ambiguous enough to be able to get through those rigid checks that they do. But sometimes, things can be interpreted as political. You could argue that a song about world peace is political technically. So the rules, whilst they do say no politics, they're quite loosely interpreted from time to time, which is why you have these songs sometimes slipping through the net. Certainly, I didn't expect Ukraine to win in 2016, and it was quite tricky when they did because I was part of the comms team, and there were a lot of questions raised.
Could you summarize what the thoughts and feelings were like at that moment?
I think people were surprised. I think that Russia was the overwhelming favourite in 2016. Sergei Lazarev was the singer, and the Russians absolutely expected to win. So there were all sorts of questions about if Russia hosted, would LGBTQ plus fans be safe in Russia, given some of the allegations going on and some of the laws that they had recently introduced. Ukraine was not expected to win, certainly backstage. And I think there was initially, I would say, a little bit of shock, if I'm honest. It was a very well performed song, but immediately we started thinking, well, what we're going to do, Ukraine are then going to be asked to host, and will they be able to host given everything that was going on in the country at the time? And so they did host it in 2017 and they did a great job, but it wasn't without its challenges. And Russia, again, they were entering a song in 2017. Again, the political tensions came out and they eventually withdrew. But I think Russia were playing a very cynical game, if I'm honest.
What do you mean by that?
So Russia had deliberately selected a singer who had been to Crimea, and the slogan for that year was celebrate diversity. Now, the singer just so happened to be a wheelchair user as well. And there were all sorts of different ways in which we were trying to work this out. Ukraine wouldn't let anyone who'd illegally visited Crimea since the annexation into the country. Therefore, she was banned. But the headline was Ukraine bans Russian wheelchair user singer in a year of celebrating diversity, and not Russia deliberately chooses a singer who's been to Crimea. But there were offers, to perform via satellite. Russia turned it down, and I think it was a very cynical move. There's lots of Russian singers who haven't been to Crimea, and they chose that one who had. I don't think they had any intention of going to Ukraine, and they withdrew at the last minute. But I think it was really about being disruptive and taking the shine off from what should have been a real triumph for Ukraine.
Do you think that had an impact on the wider community and their view on Ukraine, or do you think they could see the broader picture?
I think most people could see the cynical game that Russia were playing, really. There was lots of brilliant artists that the Russians could have chosen, and they just so happened to choose the one artist who had been to Crimea illegally, knowing full well what the Ukrainians would do. So I think most people saw through that. It was a great shame, though, because I think actually, in terms of a PR battle, Ukraine should have called their bluff and said, yep, no problem, come on in, celebrate diversity with us. They didn't do that. And I think the Russians knew they wouldn't do that, because I think if Ukraine had let them in, they would then be forced with either admitting they were playing a game or actually coming and being in Ukraine and having their Eurovision entry on the world stage.
So last year, when Russia invaded Ukraine again, FIFA banned Russia from partaking in their competitions, and then the Eurovision Song Contest also decided to stop Russia from taking part in Eurovision. And you wrote in your article that you thought that this was a highly unusual move by them. So could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so Eurovision have always gone at pains to say that it's not political, it stands above politics, which is why you have countries taking part, which sometimes have difficult political histories. So Azerbaijan and Armenia, the two technically are at state of war. There's an uneasy ceasefire at the minute, but they take part in Eurovision and they stand on that stage together. And normally with these things, they try and separate the politics from the participating countries. Belarus in 2020, they had some political issues in terms of there were protests against what was the rigged election. In 2021, they entered a song which is all about, towing the line and what happens to people who need to be taught a lesson. And that was deemed to be political given the wider context. And Belarus were asked to submit a new song. They refused, and therefore they were asked to leave the competition. When the war in Ukraine broke out, Eurovision initially had a kind of statement saying we're not a political thing, everyone's welcome. Can't remember the exact wording, but they realized a couple of days later this was not going to hold, and especially when FIFA had come in and all these international organizations were taking action, Eurovision really had no other option. And I think it's interesting that they have been so bold. It's also been a challenge for them because Russia is a huge country in terms of Eurovision, big audience. They pay a big participation fee, so there are going to be some challenges ahead in terms of countries entering. Some countries have already pulled out: Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Bosnia Herzegovina, because they can't afford the participation fees, which will inevitably go up because they no longer have the income from Russia. But in this case, I think money doesn't matter so much. It's about standing up for your values, and sometimes there is a right and a wrong. And I think it's to Eurovision's credit they're realizing that. But where do we draw the line? There's a lot of countries in Eurovision: Israel, Azerbaijan, Serbia. They have sometimes tricky situations politically. How does that get navigated? And where do you draw the line when it comes to Eurovision and who's welcome and who's not?
Do you think that there are any differences between these two conflicts that make it that meant that Russia was a more obvious option to remove compared to what's happening with Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Yeah, I think the Azerbaijan and Armenia issue is a little bit more complicated, and it's been going on for much longer. So it proceeded when they entered Eurovision. So Armenia entered in 2006, Azerbaijan 2007. Now, this war in Nagorno-Karabakh is a little bit more complicated because it is a disputed territory. According to international law, it's recognized as belonging to Azerbaijan, but the Armenians claim it as theirs because there's a lot of Armenian people living there. So it's quite tricky in terms of right and wrong. But I think with Ukraine and Russia, it was very clear that this was an invasion of one sovereign country by an aggressor. And certainly when it was years ago, back in the days of when they were entering Eurovision, there were a lot of point swapping between Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. They were all great friends, so it was very different. Whereas Azerbaijan and Armenia never had diplomatic relations right from the start, and that's why we've seen the tensions coming over sometimes on that Eurovision stage. In 2009, people who voted for Armenia in Azerbaijan were called in for questioning, allegedly, and in the same year, there was a postcard image, a video image between the Armenian entry in the semi-final. Now that had a statue which is in Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan complained and said that's actually Azerbaijan. So for the grand final, that was taken out of the Armenian postcard. The Armenians didn't like that, and during the voting, they then held up pictures of the statue very, very deliberately. So you've got this kind of needling going on. These things happen. I think when it comes to those two countries, it is political. There's no getting away from that. The way in which the juries cast their votes, they do ranking order every year. Azerbaijan and Armenia rank each other's songs last. All 5 jurors do that. That's not a coincidence, that's politics. But unfortunately, there are some things you can control and some things which you can't, and that never really affects the result overall.
Someone might say, well, what's the point in stopping someone from singing? What's the point in stopping Russia from playing football? What would you say is the deeper meaning behind it all?
Well, I would say it's about values and what you're willing to accept and what you're willing to not. And I think also with Russia, they use soft power diplomacy, cultural diplomacy as a way of legitimizing Putin's government. So I think the risk is if Russia won, they would then host it and use it almost as a term of or a platform for propaganda. I think it's about standing up and saying what type of Europe or what type of world do we want to live in? And certainly what had happened in Ukraine, there is a right and a wrong, and I think they have done the correct thing by banning Russia. It's a shame for a lot of Russian Eurovision fans and a lot of Russians who didn't want this war. But as I say, there is a right and a wrong, and sometimes you just have to follow what is right and wrong.
Like last year, because Ukraine won Eurovision last year, would you and sometimes people will suggest that voting within Eurovision is slightly political in itself. Countries vote for their sort of friends, things like that. Would you say that vote for Ukraine last year was a political one?
I think the massive vote for Ukraine was absolutely overwhelming. I think there are only 2 countries where the public didn't give Ukraine 12 points. We've never seen voting like that. So I don't really think it was political. I think it was more humanitarian. It was a message of solidarity with people in Ukraine. Certainly, politics does come into Eurovision, but when it comes to the voting, I think it's completely exaggerated, if I'm honest. I think it's more cultural. You've got countries that don't necessarily get on, but they vote for each other. The Balkan countries, for example, and that's because they know each other's singers and musicians. It's the same with the Scandinavian countries, and it used to be the case of a lot of Baltic countries would vote for Russia. Again, it's either because of the Russians who lived there, or they know the Russian singer. You might Dima Bilan, who won in 2008, was very popular across that part of Europe. But if we're talking about politics and neighbourly voting, the UK gave Ireland 12 points in 2011 because it was Jedward. Now, Jedward were well known in the UK. They'd taken part in X Factor and they were popular. They were our neighbours, yes, but we weren't voting for them because it was Ireland. It was because we knew their singer. And I think that's what's happening in a lot of other countries as well. And I think certainly the UK's misfortune in the contest, if you like, in the past 20 odd years, our lack of strong results has not really been political. I genuinely don't think people are sitting in Cyprus, in Norway, Moldova, thinking that's a great song, but we're not voting for the UK out of principle. They're probably just thinking, oh, wasn't Greece good, or wasn't the Latvian entry interesting, and then picking up the phone. I think they do judge us differently because of our music industry. They probably think, oh, Ed Sheeran, Adele, and then when it comes to Eurovision, we've got people who can't sing in tune, or songs that are very, very weak. And just finally, just on the subject of we're disliked, I genuinely don't believe that. I think there's a lot of goodwill towards Britain, and despite everything else that's happening, and you don't get other countries that haven't won for a long time saying that. So Spain haven't won since 1969, and yet people don't think about Spain being disliked. And same with Ireland. Everyone loves an Irish pub, and yet they've not won for a long time. It's more about the song. It's more about certainly the UK no longer having that language advantage, being part of bigger song contests now where countries can choose to sing in English. We've seen the fortunes of the UK, Ireland, and Malta, who previously were the only countries who sang in English. Have we seen their fortunes go down as other countries have started singing in English? So it's not politics. We just haven't been good enough. But we were last year, and that's why we came second.
Has Russian state TV, are they no longer showing Eurovision in protest to Russia being banned from Eurovision?
So I believe that the Russian broadcasters have actually been expelled from the European Broadcasting Union, and I don't know whether that's a full expulsion or if it's just a suspension for a few years. So they won't be broadcasting Eurovision. They've no longer got broadcasting rights, but certainly viewers in Russia can watch it on YouTube. There's a live stream, and I'm sure they'll be able to enjoy it there. But it's a great shame. But as I say, it's a tricky situation. I remember in 2017 being part of the comms team and being worried during the night of the grand final that something was going to happen. I wasn't thinking that there would be any kind of attack, but I was worried about things like the Wi-Fi going down or there being a power cut. Certainly these things were real fears at the time, and I know that already in Liverpool they're upping up that. I know already in Liverpool they're really upping the security, but especially the cybersecurity, because it is a risk, and certainly it could become a target. And it would be a shame if Ukraine's contest in the UK was targeted by people who wanted to do wrong by Ukraine.
Do you think that's a substantial threat at the moment?
I think it's maybe not a substantial threat, but it's definitely a threat. And it's not just a thing about Russia. It could be any kind of cyber attack. But certainly these are the things you need to watch out for now. It's not necessarily the kind of big things. It's little low level things which just cause a few problems. That's all you need to just create panic or to just disrupt things. And when the Wi-Fi goes down, it's incredibly difficult because that affects things like the website, it affects things like the voting. There's a lot of things to consider. So it will be a very secure broadcast, and they will have checks and balances in place. But yeah, the threat is there and it is real.
Do you think that you can see Russia rejoining Eurovision in the future, either them being allowed to rejoin or them willingly want to rejoin?
I think it might be a bit of wounded pride. I think it's going to take a long time for Russia to come back. The only way I would see Russia coming back is if there was a change of government. I can't see Russia coming back to the competition with Putin at the helm. There could well be another Russian revolution. Who knows? Stranger things have happened. I think when it comes to the European Broadcasting Union, it's up to them. They have to admit countries based on their values, but the EBU also have a responsibility as well to public service media and supporting with that and helping other countries to develop their broadcasting capabilities, if you like. So it is a shame that Russia aren't part of it, but ultimately it's not really anything that we can do or the European Broadcasting Union can do. It's in Russia's hands, but I can't see them coming back anytime soon.
And my last question would be, who's your favourite contestants so far? Who should we look out for? Who do you think is going to do really well?
So I've got a couple of favourites this year. I think the one that I didn't quite get, but I really get now, is Finland. It's called Cha Cha Cha. It's a big heavy metal number, but it's really engaging. The singer, I met him a few weeks ago at the London Eurovision party, and he's a really nice guy. And I guess when you've had that experience with someone on a personal level, it kind of changes your view a little bit. Certainly, I think my favourites overall are Italy, which is a big ballad. Marco Magoni, he's represented them before. 2013, he came fourth. And I think the UK have got a great song. The UK song as a pop song is brilliant. I just hope she'll be able to do a good performance on the night, and I hope the nerves don't get the better of her. But hopefully, with the home crowd behind her, she'll do well. But change takes time, and as we've seen in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Portugal, these are countries that weren't necessarily doing well, and eventually they did well and they won. So I think even if we don't do well this year, let's keep going. Let's keep trying to enter really good emerging artists, because as Sam Ryder showed, it's a great launch pad. And Sweden this year, they're another one to watch. Sweden's entry, Loreen, she won it in 2012 with a song called Euphoria, and she's back again. So it's going to be an exciting grand final, I think, and I just hope it's close. And I hope Finland. I hope Finland win, actually, because I've got money on them too.